Hello everyone, today we're going to be learning about the pawn as well as how it moves. It's pretty straightforward, so let's just get straight into it. So the pawn is worth 1, but all you need to know is that it's the least valuable piece, so it's the least powerful among all the other pieces. And let's look at how the pawn moves. So the pawn moves only 1 square forward, and it can't move backwards, and it captures the opponent's pieces 1 square diagonally. So let's look at what all this means. So we're told that the pawn can only move 1 square forward, which looks like this. So the white pawn can go 1 square forward like this, or this pawn can go 1 square forward, as well as the black pawns can also go 1 square forward, just like this. And it can't move backwards. So once you've moved this pawn, for example, here, that means for the rest of the game you can't just go back. And pawns also have a special rule that when you're on your starting position, so this is the starting position for the white pawns, because that's where they start, on this rank. And for the black pawns, they start on this rank, so this is their starting position. So these two lines that I've drawn is the starting position for the white and black pawns. So when they're on this starting position, they have a special rule that they're able to move actually twice up the board. So for example, rather than only being able to go once up the board, the white pawn can actually jump 2 squares up the board now. And again, the same rule always applies, pawns can't move backward. And this is only possible, again, as I said, when you're on this starting position. So for example, now that this pawn has moved twice up the board, for the rest of the game it can only go once up the board. And similarly, let's say this black pawn goes twice up the board, so let's say it goes like this. Now this pawn can't go once up the board for the rest of the game. Twice up the board, sorry. And now, for example, if I move this white pawn here, now that I've moved this white pawn here, because it's moved out of its starting position, I can't move twice up for the rest of the game, and of course I can't go backwards. So as you can see, pawns are quite simple. Now, we're told that pawns capture pieces 1 square diagonally. So this is where 1 square diagonally would be to this pawn, these two squares. So if there's any pieces on these two squares, the white pawn could actually capture it. So for example, if black plays this move, now again he can go here because he's in his starting position, he can go twice up. So if the black pawn goes here, then you'll notice this white pawn can capture this pawn here because it's 1 square diagonal to it. Now, some people get confused that they think that pawns can completely capture diagonally, which is not the case. So if there's a piece here, so let's say black goes here, that doesn't mean that this pawn can just go capture this piece here, because you'll notice this is 2 squares diagonally to the pawn. You're only allowed to capture diagonally once left or right, so here. So if we look back to this move, I can take this pawn like this, or instead of black plays this move, then I could capture this pawn because it's 1 square diagonal to me. So that means if there's a pawn in front of you like this, you can't capture it because remember, 1 square diagonal. So that means that these two pawns are stuck, right? This black pawn can't move forward because there's another piece in front of it, and this one can't go forward because there's a piece in front of it. So this also just highlights another point that when there's a piece in front of a pawn, it can't move unless, of course, there's a piece you can capture 1 square diagonal to it. So in summary, pawns only go 1 square forward. They can move twice up in their starting position, but once they've moved from their starting position, let's say this pawn goes here, you can't go twice up the board again. And we also said that they capture 1 square diagonally to them. Now there is one last very special rule about pawns that makes the game really interesting, is that when pawns reach the end of the board, they can actually become or promote to any piece. So these pawns start on this rank, right? So the end of the board for them would be here because they would have to move all this distance to reach the end of the board. Now if I look at the black pawns, this is where they start. The end of the board for them would be here because this is where the board ends for them. So when pawns reach the end of the board, they can promote to any piece. So let's look at this mean. So here, you'll see this is a much simplified position. You'll notice that all of the pieces are gone. They've been traded during the game. And now you have this position where black has a king and a pawn, and white has a king and 2 pawns. So what I just told you guys was that when the pawn reaches the end of the board, it can become any piece. So if this pawn goes here, it can become any piece it wants. And if this white pawn goes here, it becomes any piece it wants. And if this black pawn goes here, it becomes any piece it wants. Now, there is something important to highlight when I say any piece it wants. I mean every piece except for a pawn and a king. This is very important. When you reach to the end of the board, you can become every single piece on the board, which means you can become a knight, you can become a bishop, you can become a queen, you can become a rook. If you haven't learned these pieces, don't get confused. They're just the pieces you can promote into. So you can become any piece, all of those pieces I just mentioned, except for the king and a pawn. You cannot become a king or a pawn. So let's see how all this looks like. So in this position, it's black's turn to play. So you'll notice the black is still on his starting position, right? And that means he can move twice up the board. Now he's getting very close to reaching the end of the board. And this pawn is on its starting position, so it can move twice up the board. This pawn isn't in its starting position, so it can only move once up. So let's say I decide to move this one, it goes forward twice. Now let's say the black pawn decides to go forward, and the pawns keep marching up the board, they're just going one square forward. Again, that's pretty much all they can do. They keep going forward, and now we're going to look and see what I mean. So you'll notice the black pawn was here, and it moved all this distance the way here. And on the next turn, it's going to reach the end of the board. So now it can become any piece it wants, and as you can see, I have options. I can become a queen, I can become a knight, a rook, or a bishop. So again, any piece except for a king and a pawn. So usually we always choose a queen because the queen's the most powerful piece. So black makes a queen, and then white on the next turn is about to reach the end of the board, so he can also become a queen. So now the white pawn can go and become a queen here. So that's basically all the rules you need to know for the pawn. It can get quite confusing to remember all of them, but it's quite simple. There's not too much to it. All you just need to know is that when pawns reach the end of the board, they become queens, and the rule that when they're on their starting position, they can move twice up the board. That's really all there is to pawns. And that, of course, you need to know that there's 8 of them on the board. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. 4 plus 4 makes 8. And let's just do one puzzle before we end this video. So in this puzzle, they're asking us to capture, then promote. So we know pawns capture one square diagonally. Now, I want you to pause this video, think how many stars can I capture, and then make a queen. So I'd need to reach the end of the board, which is here. So again, you're only allowed to move one square forward, you're not in your starting position. So let's think this through. So I'm supposed to capture as many stars as possible. Right now I have 2 moves. Remember, you cannot go one square diagonally if there isn't a piece. So in this case, there is a piece, which is a star. So you can capture the star one square diagonally, so let's go take it. Now you'll notice I have 2 stars that I can capture, so which one do I take? There is actually an answer to this, and you can think logically about it. If I capture this star, then I actually can't move anywhere, because there's no piece one square diagonal, and there's a piece in front of me. And remember, when there's a piece in front of you, or in this case a star, you can't move anywhere. So instead, what I'll do is I'll capture this star, and I'll take this star, because now I have a path. There isn't a star for me to capture here, but I can capture one here, because there's one square diagonal to me. So again, I can capture this star now, and then again there's one square diagonal, there's another star to me, and I can just capture this, and now because I've reached the end of the board, I can make any piece I want. Remember, the queen is most powerful, so we usually choose the queen, and now I've made a queen, and I can just capture these 2 stars, and the puzzle will be complete. So that's basically all you need to know for the pawns. It's relatively simple. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, and I'll see you guys next time.